an epistemic theory of Fregean sense. I'll start with Frege. I think most people are familiar with, especially the later descriptivist development of the Fregean sense in semantics. So sense for Frege, it is how it is given. So Venus, when it's in the evening, when people call that Hesperus, Venus is given to the agent one way and phosphorus is given in another. So sin, which in German, Frege wrote, the art as Gegenscheins. Max Black translates that as mode of presentation. But it's a little bit too much intellectual, because something could be given to you, of course, perceptually given to you, but there are other sort of nuances that's been discussed in enactivism or even ecological differences, like given to us as to how we can operate with that thing and in terms of affordances. So for Frege, the problem is the epistemic value or erkenntniswert of the identity. If it is just the reference, that's the semantic value of the sentence, then it's just an object identical with that object. Then how is that epistemically valuable? How does that add value to my epistemic stage? How is it that it's a piece of knowledge when I know that Hesperus is identical with phosphorus? And Frege explains that with the difference in senses, the difference in its givenness. But then I have to clarify that Frege distinguishes concept and idea. Concept, Begriff, it's roughly like property. So when we make a judgment, an affirmative judgment, we affirm of an object that it has some property. Through predication, we use a predicate to do that, and roughly put, it's asserting of the object of having that mark, of having a property of, or of belonging, of falling under the concept of that concept. So the concept and falling under the concept in today's term is extension, or back in, to use Frege's own German, it's Begriff Umfang. Hesperus is bright is simply to affirm of Hesperus that it falls under the concept of brightness. In German, fällt unter den Begriff des. And that distinguishes from idea, Vorstellung. So let's say description is a star or is a planet. Different agents have different descriptions about Hesperus. Some think it's a star, some think it's a planet. So that's how people have different ideas. And for Max Black, he translates that as conception. So people have different conception or associated conception with the name or about the object. They have different conception about the object. And this differs from sense, because sense is universal. And when people use a name like Hesperus, they have to grasp the sense, and it's that sense, it's exactly that sense that's been grasped. And to use Frege's own example, it's like in a telescope. The object is the moon, and then there's the image formed on the other end of the telescope. It's like the sense, and everyone who wants to look through the telescope to see the moon has to grasp that sense. It's there, it's that way, it's for everyone. And of course, for Frege, he said it's objective. And how is it objective, and whether it's mind independent, and how is it independent of agents, epistemic agents? I'll discuss that later on. But an idea is agent relative, because with the same sense, different idea might be formed, like there could be differences in retinal images. And then after several decades, there came Saul Kripke, and he wants to point out that, yeah, description, it plays some role in our language, but it's at least for names, it's not to give meaning, but to fix reference. And how do we do that? We can illustrate that with circularity. So there's two ways to understand circularity that Kripke talks about. In an epistemic sense, suppose someone uses a name and you don't know what he's referring to. So he clarifies the semantics of his term through clarifying the identity. So he gives you a description, maybe at least identifying in the context. So in the context, you will have known what he is talking about. So suppose there are two persons at a bar, and someone says, the one drinking martini, right? And exactly that person is drinking a martini with the typical glass that holds martini. Then that description would have identified the referent of his term. Then that's one way to epistemically determine the semantics, which is epistemically. So people, the speaker, would have come to know what the semantics is. But then there's the metaphysical determination to decide the semantics of a term, like to name something, to give a name. So the name that did not have the semantics that you wanted to have will now have the semantics that you've determined, that you've decided through that metaphysical determination. And Kripke calls that an initial baptism. And there's an object that's salient, and sometimes we use ostension to point to what we're naming, and sometimes we use a description. And let's say we can name, so to use Kripke's own example, Neptune, it was named via a description, even without perceptual contact, without direct perceptual contact. It's a description that's, and the astronomical object that's been causing some disturbances. So that's how the name had its reference fixed or metaphysically determined. It did not have that semantics before the naming, but now it has it. And afterwards, when people follow reference from the initial baptizers, following the intended reference, other people might not know what the semantics is, but the semantics is already determined. Then that determination would have only been epistemic, so to clarify terms. So in a naming ceremony with mutual agreement, given common knowledge about what convention, the linguistic convention that's gonna set up, that agreement constitutes the normativity of semantic rule of how we're going to use the name to refer to the intended referent. And given that there's a difference between, that there's a use of description at a naming ceremony, initial baptism, then there's comes the problem of the contingent a priori. And this is a special case because Jack the Ripper, Kripke wasn't explicit whether it's some people would use the term descriptive name, but if it is a proper name, like any other name, it's just that there's some sort of connotation that's not semantic, and I will explain that later. So there's some murder that's been happening in London, and the murder style is very similar across the murder, and the police who couldn't find who the serial killer is decided to call him or her, let's say it's a man, Jack the Ripper. Given how we name Jack the Ripper, we know without further information that Jack the Ripper committed those murder, but it is in virtue of the situation that we know that the police, nor even anyone, except Jack the Ripper himself or the victims, know who Jack the Ripper is. So we could have a knowledge without further empirical investigation that's about the world that could have been false because Jack the Ripper could have refrained from committing those murder. So that's a case of contingent a priori, and how a priori it is controversial, but at least to understand how it is contingent, we have to understand that Jack the Ripper is a rigid destination because there are possible worlds in which Jack the Ripper did not commit any murder, especially those murder. And for that to happen, Jack the Ripper in the actual world that we refer to has to be the same person in that other possible world. So that's how it is contingent. But then there's a slight difference among Putnam and Kripke, who are both called causal theorists of reference in the literature, because Putnam focuses on stereotype, and it is a linguistic obligation for you to know some stereotype about certain term like tiger. You have to know at least that it's an animal, right? So if you don't know that, you don't have the competence to maybe engage in conversation. So you need to have a little bit of description about the referent in order for you to use the word, but he wasn't explicit whether you wouldn't be able to refer. But if, as Kripke himself pointed out, that we were to have a less charitable interpretation, Kripke would have distinguished himself with the following case. So for Putnam, with the division of labor, division of linguistic labor, the experts, they know better about, they're better at identifying what a certain kind is, but they're not an expert about the semantics of the term, but they're expert about the identity or the kind of certain things. So a linguistic community, there are some members who use the word like am or beach without being able to perceptually distinguish M's and beach, but they can still use those words to refer. And as we all know, Putnam uses that illustration to argue for the case that meanings are not in the head. But if the semantics of layman's use is constituted by experts' identification, then there's a problem, because Kripke would ask, so suppose there's a rare substance that only a few experts, a few chemists could have identified it. And one day there's an international conference and everyone flew there to attend the conference, and someone just there's a terrorist attack and there's a bomb and killed all experts. So from now on, no one could have identified that substance. So does it follow that, let's call it substance, it used to be, it is under the name of omega. But now does omega, the term omega, lose its reference, lose its semantics? Or are we in the position to say that we don't know what omega is anymore? So if Jack the Ripper could have been someone that's almost no one, or again, except the perpetrator, Jack the Ripper himself, and the victims, no one else would have known who he is. It doesn't follow that it doesn't refer, right? So with that setting up, there's also the meaning giving way of understanding description. And the most, so I'm not talking about names, because I think Kripke, in naming a necessity at least, believes in analyticity. So if all bachelors are unmarried, if it is true in virtue of meaning, and if bachelors are given its meaning with the description, being an unmarried man, defined, if bachelors are defined like that, then it's true in virtue of meaning. But it's just that we can ask whether, if something is true in virtue of meaning, then analytic truths are necessarily true. Of course, there's a question of all bachelors are unmarried. That's what follows from its analyticity. Again, it doesn't immediately follow that all bachelors are necessarily unmarried. It's possible that some bachelors are married. It's just that those are the actual bachelors, right? But if we think more clearly about that sentence, some bachelors are possibly married. Yeah, I am a bachelor myself, but I could have been married, right? So some bachelors are possibly married. If we think in terms of that, then we can see that even for analytic statement that are true in virtue of meaning, is the reference, is the object in the world that constitute the meaning. So even if it's true in virtue of meaning, it is still dependent on the world. It is still dependent on non-linguistic facts. So even if all bachelors are unmarried is a sentence someone could have known to be true only on semantic competence to understand, to have the required semantic competence with like all are bachelors unmarried, even only that, it is still knowledge that's constituted by non-linguistic facts. Okay, so this is me, and this is from my MPhil research a few years ago. But then I want to put description into the following light. That's epistemic, and different people either have different epistemic competence and even evidence. And that difference would constitute something along the following line, like different perspectives relative to different agents with different initial epistemic state, different knowledge, different things happening. And I will illustrate that in the following way. So suppose you want to know something, but given your prior knowledge, the same evidence would have justified you to know that, but someone else with different initial prior knowledge, he would not have known the same thing given that evidence. Let's say you know that my name is Rachel, Zhang Wai Long, or in Cantonese it's Zhang Wai Long, but you wouldn't have known that if you saw in let's say the mainland China's newspaper in English, when it writes Zhang Wei ZHANG and then the following, you wouldn't have known that it's a name that refers to me and it's been describing me. The same piece of news article, if it is an evidence about anything at all, would not have constituted your knowledge because of your prior ignorance about the Chinese language. And on the other hand, even if we know the same thing, that piece of knowledge could have encoded different information. So my knowledge that Hesperus is bright might come with my knowledge that Hesperus is also Venus, that it's, I think, the fourth planet from the sun. So my knowledge that Hesperus is bright, given the way that I am, differs from someone who is ignorant of Hesperus being Venus, or even Hesperus being the fourth planet from the sun. So our epistemic state, although we both know that Hesperus is bright, our epistemic state encodes different information. On the other hand, given same evidence or even same prior knowledge, there could be difference in reason, such that maybe someone with better statistical intelligence could have made statistical inferences better and increase the precision of a description. I could describe myself of being an Asian, but if you know better about the spelling of my English name, then you would know more about that I'm born in Hong Kong. So, well, of course, that's adding a description, but that's if to describe well, with more description, that's the second thing, that's adding a description. But if to increase precision, you can say that I'm 1.7 meter tall, but to increase your description, you can be more precise. And of course, that's also depends on the statistical intelligence and holding the evidence fixed. Okay. So here it is. So what it is that I think is Fregean sense. I'll use epistemic content to illustrate that. Sense, to use Frege's own term, after Kripke's understanding of reference fixing of names, and even something epistemic in the contingent a priori. Sense, as Frege uses the term, would have simply been the actual right idea. So because we could have different ideas about Hesperus, right? Hesperus, some people think that it's a star, some think that it's a planet, some have the right idea, some have the wrong idea. But then when we have a conception that's true of the referent, and in linguistically, that's a description, and that's the sense of the name, and that's what we know about the object. That's a property we would attribute to the object. And of course, it's biased towards actuality, because the sense of Hesperus could not have been, at least in the actual world, being the dog that just passed me by. It couldn't have been because it's not, because Hesperus is a planet, and that you could have an idea that's the wrong idea, but that's something else. So sense is just the right idea that's actually right because that's true of the referent. Then description. An object could have been given to you differently, and therefore, if you were to describe, well, how it is given to you, that's a description, right? Hesperus is given Venus, well, in the evening, it's given to us. So Hesperus is given to us as an astronomical object occupying a certain position in the sky in the evening. So if we were to describe our observation, that's the description, but that's linguistic instead of merely mental. So description, that's just given how I illustrate the epistemic perspectivity. It's just how our epistemic state updates differently, because if you were to know that Hesperus is the observable in the evening, right? But then you saw in the morning Venus, you think it's beautiful because it's against a bright backdrop, it's still tingling, and you think that that's tickling, twinkling. Against such a backdrop, it's still doing that. You thought it's beautiful, but you would not thereby update your epistemic state into a posterior epistemic state in which you know that Hesperus is beautiful in the morning. You don't know that. It doesn't update your epistemic state that way. So that's how description, Fregean sense, interact with epistemology. It is a little bit like adding a different true sentence in the belief box, a little bit like that, because you would have, instead of adding Hesperus is bright, Hesperus is beautiful in the morning, you would have maybe phosphorus under that name. Phosphorus is beautiful in the morning, and without making the inference or without adding a further sentence, because you don't know that Hesperus is phosphorus. And to go on with a little bit about communication, because usually when we talk about the Gricean or the Lockean idea of communication, we talk about the thought expressed. But then given that sometimes we might know our semantics without knowing the metaphysics, or at least the identity, if not also the kind of the referent, then there's a problem of not knowing what we're thinking or not knowing what we are saying. But then if there's something like a speaker meaning, then we know that speaker meaning interact with background knowledge, because, so let's go back to the case of Jack the Ripper. So Jack the Ripper is a man. So suppose someone say that, well, the police are still, the situation did not change. And then someone said that. When it's Jack the Ripper said that, the speaker meaning, the thought expressed, he's saying of a particular person that he knows who that is, that he is a man. So that's one thing, the same sentence, the same utterance, the assertion. So that's something like a little bit like narrow content that I'm trying to get at, because of the more background knowledge of Jack the Ripper. So when it says Jack the Ripper is a man, the thought expressed, all the narrow content is different from when the police investigators, maybe they found out that all the victims have been a female and they've been raped. So they hypothesize, or they assert that Jack the Ripper is a man, but then the narrow content or the thought expressed, that they don't predicate of exactly one particular person that they know of to be that person of manhood. They don't do that. They just, Jack the Ripper, whoever that is a man. It's something like that. So, so we have distinguished between the thought expressed and the information transmitted. If there's something there's a kind of content of thought that's internally accessible, narrow content. If there's something like that, and for us to talk about speaker meaning, if we intended, like the Gricean picture, if we intended that I induce a belief or thought in someone else's mind, then I have to roughly know the content of the thought that's been induced. So of course, that I use the term Jack the Ripper instead of any other term. There's a common ground among the linguistic users in the linguistic community, the convention that's been set up, the semantic rule of how we use the term Jack the Ripper to refer to Jack the Ripper. And so with that presupposition, Jack the Ripper uses his own name to attribute to himself that he is a man. Okay, so so I've laid out my epistemic theory of Fregean sense, and then I'll look back a little at Ludwig Wittgenstein to go back to the Tractatus. He also uses the term sense, and he's also he speaks German. He's Austrian, I think, and Unsinn, that's from the root sin. So the sense of a proposition is its agreement and disagreement with the possibilities of the existence and non-existence of the atomic fact. So of course, some like Rudolf Carnap, he attributes a possible world's semantics to Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ideas for possible world semantics are in the Tractatus, as Rudolf Carnap acknowledges. So the sense of a proposition, it is a little bit like a description of the world that distinguishes what is and what is not through facts that the description is true of, and those that are not or even false of. And we know that the ways the world could not have been, there are ways the world could have been, and that's metaphysical possibilities, but there are ways the world could not have been. Like I could not have been a robot, and Ludwig Wittgenstein could not have been a female. So these possibilities that we can talk about, that we could form some notion about, but they're impossible. So they are unreal and at best fictitious. Of course, there are some unreal possibilities, metaphysical impossibilities that no one thought about and no one constituted those possibilities. And I don't know whether we could even call exactly a certain possibilities as fictitious if no one conceived them, no one conjectured them, no one imagined those scenarios, even impossible as they are. So the fictitious, it might be restricted by human intellectual activities, including fantasy. And this is how I understand Wittgenstein's the latter analogy of nonsense. So after understanding him, those nonsense, those metaphysical impossibilities, like how the relation between thought and the world is, those alternative, unreal way the relation between thought and the world is, it's been ruled out. They're just nonsense. You thought it is possible, you thought there are life options, but now you know that they're just not. But in the end, the world is the way it is. There's nothing contingent that you've learned. And so that's how I understand sense and see how Wittgenstein, another German speaker, uses the term. And on the other hand, senseless or sinless. For Wittgenstein, tautology is senseless. So I would understand that as alternatives are a priori impossibilities. So if, well, mathematics and logic, there's some difference. Let me use logic. So P and Q implies materially implies Q. So P and Q implies Q. That's tautology. And alternatives such as P and Q and not Q. I could know a priori that these are impossibilities. These alternatives are not. So that's why even when we've been shown with certain sentence, tautological sentences, we haven't ruled out any alternatives. So that's how it is senseless, but it is true. That's what Wittgenstein thinks is different from something that people call metaphysical truths. It's true, but it doesn't rule out any alternatives. And that's why it is sinnlos instead of unsinn. So, and here it is how I would I want to highlight something that's, if we talk about a sense, there are some sense that are necessarily a true description. So let's say 0 measures the numerosity of the set of object X such that Fx, there's no such thing. So that's Frege's analysis, I think, of the number 0 or the numerals. I think and analyzes the number, but then that description is necessarily true because there are no possible world in which the set of object X does not measure 0, so 0 measure that in all possible worlds. So that's a necessarily true description. So for Frege, he would think that that's like the sense of the term 0. But then we have to distinguish between the reference and the sufficient information, because even if we know a priori some identifying description of 0, and that a priori knowledge, even if it is a sense, it doesn't immediately follow that sense of a term is always is necessarily the way it is, no matter what, because 0 is special because it refers to some mathematical object. It refers to a number. Okay, so I hope that that's Frege. And in conclusion, I've hinted at how I would look back and understand what Frege did with Kripke's metaphysics. He brings back Aristotelian essentialism. He thinks that they're essence, and to use modality to understand essence. An essential property is just a necessary property, and to use possible world to understand modality. So necessary property, that's a property that the object has in all possible worlds. Well, for Kripke, there's a question of whether if the object is exists or not, and the problem about the variable domain, but I'll ignore that here. But for Kripke, for Frege, he starts, well, he is a mathematician. So when he thinks about mathematics, if mathematics is the metaphysical space of number and various other things, then truths about number, they are metaphysical truths and necessary truths. So the sense that we come to have, if they're not merely knowledge, we could be confused about the necessity of the truth of the description because of the metaphysics of the object of study, with the description being simply true. So Hesperus could have been not observable in the evening. I think, well, maybe like tonight, something knock it down, knock it out of its orbit, then Hesperus would be not observable. And if a long time ago, it's like that. Of course, when we think about how that name came about, how it originates from Greek mythology, this sounds strange. But to use that as a case to illustrate that the name Hesperus could have had another sense. Maybe in some other time, when in another possible world, Venus, it just happens that the same spelling with because the story it's about, I think, two siblings, right? And it's it doesn't have to be an astronomical object observable in the evening, and even to use other terms that's less with less connotation, because if it's from a Greek mythology, then there is some connotation, right? So even if given the way it is, Donald Trump, the name Donald J. Trump, has the sense of being the 45th president of the United States. If it is a sense, if it is the sense of the name in a semantic way, well, then Donald J. Trump, the name, could have had another sense. And that's because he is not necessarily the 45th POTUS, while the cases that Frege uses, like the intersection between A and B and the intersection between B and C, he uses this example to illustrate that the two intersection, they have something different, but they refer to this the same point. But that description would interact with the world in a certain way necessarily. It doesn't follow that the sense of a term is necessary, especially with terms of worldly object that are neither natural kinds nor metaphysical.